Welcome to the DEC4 podcast. You can access episodes, companion articles, research notes and links, as well as information about our contributors and supporters at DEC4podcast.com. Hope you enjoy the program. Hello and thank you for listening. Our leading contributor, Gary Wells, from the hit website soulrideblog.com, your home for vintage leisure, joins us this episode to explore two tumultuous decades in the lives of the Beach Boys through the lens of Malcolm Leo's 1985 BAFTA-nominated documentary film, The Beach Boys, An American Band. We'll learn about some of the key people on both sides of the camera and of Malcolm Leo's commitment to sourcing a wide variety of music and interview clips long before the easy accessibility of digital archives to create an intimate first-person narrative. The Beach Boys, An American Band is undoubtedly a fan's movie. If you already love the Beach Boys, you'll love them even more after immersing yourself in this documentary. A little spoiler for you, we do love it. But we also have to consider just how objective a documentarian can be when working on an authorised project, and did the Beach Boys honour their promise of granting right of final cut? We also look at whether or not Malcolm Leo managed to achieve his ambition of not making a puff piece, and note that this is far from the whole story then and since, with another 40 years of eventful Beach Boys history to come. We really do hope you enjoy this deep dive into the Beach Boys, An American Band. Gary Wells, great to see you. A very, very warm welcome back.
Good to see you, my friend. Nice to see you.
Now, before we get into our subject for this episode, we have a bit of podcasting news, and your literary podcast, Words with Wellesley, which is part of the Cocktail Nation podcast, has kind of been unleashed, hasn't it? Can you tell us what's happening there?
Well, yes, I'm happy to say that I'm back for my 7th season of offering book reviews, book recommendations on the Cocktail Nation radio show with Coop Cooper out of Sydney, Australia. Yeah, so once a month I'm on there to discuss a certain book with, some sort of vintage connotations. And also this year, Coop has snipped out the past Words with Wellesley's episodes and issued them as a standalone podcast, available wherever you get your pods. He's calling it Alone with Words with Wellesley.
And just on the subject of Soul Ride, really congratulations on that, because that has kicked up another gear altogether this year in reach and in influence. And one of the great things about it now is the appreciation that it is getting from some people who are really quite closely associated with some of your subjects, and the enthusiasm that it's being embraced by people who were actually part of this world that you're writing about. They're particularly complimentary about the accuracy and I think probably the good faith and spirit in which it's written. So congratulations on that success.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't know if a big part of it is just the time in the trenches, and eventually the way the internet works, there's more and more traffic driven to your site, but I'll go ahead and say it's because of the quality of the content and some of the deeper cuts. The people who are even related to these subjects or have worked with them in the past, they have reached out to me and they've been really complimentary, just appreciative, just saying thank you for shining a light on so-and-so. So that's my jam, the deeper cuts, and the site is going really well with a lot of help from you too, George, so I thank you for that.
Oh, no, thank you, Gary. And one thing to note as well is you are always very conscientious about responding to people who make comments on your various posts, which really does create this lovely sense of community with your fans, and a really nice safe space to talk about all things vintage leisure, which I think is increasingly important in this fraught internet universe. Okay, let us get down to business. We are talking about the Beach Boys, An American Band. It's 1980. Well, the copyright was 1984, but it was released in 1985, a documentary film about the Beach Boys by an established music documentarian named Malcolm Leo. Before we start to have a look at the movie in depth, Gary, where does this sit in your Beach Boys journey?
Well, as I was rewatching and preparing for this meeting with you, George, I was reminded and I was almost not emotional, but this really is hardly an origin story for me. I wanted to search my memory banks for my first knowledge of this documentary, and I have to believe that I taped it off television. It couldn't have been that old when I did so. It would have been the late 1980s, and so I taped it off television. I remember because when I was watching it recently, I have it now on the magic of VHS, and I remember the certain parts in the doc when the commercials would come in. Sometimes you have that recall of things. So taped it off television, found it on VHS. So the documentary is early days for me, and I made some notes while I was rewatching it. Some of the songs even where I had never heard before in my life, and I didn't even know what they were or what they were singing. So a lot of the music this is the origin for me hearing it. And certainly the story, I think, this is, along with Stephen Gaines' book, Heroes and Villains, this is really where I came in when it came to my love for the Beach Boys.
And it's worth mentioning, I think there's more than one edit in circulation. So I was working off a version that was 1 hour, 44 minutes.
That's what mine is too. I wasn't aware of the different edits, but that's what mine is as well.
Excellent. Now, a couple of interesting people behind it. Malcolm Leo, who we mentioned. Now, we've linked to some biographical details on this episode's webpage. He has a kind of interesting way of working in that he collates various existing clips to bring together to create a narrative. In his words, he said it became an interesting methodology, basically taking movies from where they might be, or clips that might be lying dormant in vaults, taking X and Y and getting Z out of it. And he obviously has done that with this particular film because he's source clips from a number of television shows and previous specials and concerts from the Beach Boys. My version doesn't have clip credits at the end, so we've kind of worked out where, I guess, the more significant ones, or where it's perhaps a little more important to realise where they came from. But a couple of other interesting people involved. Cinematography by John Toll, who went on to win consecutive Oscars in 1994 and 95 for Legends of the Fall and Braveheart. And according to IMDb, his most recent credit is 80 for Brady, so he's still working and doing very well. Tucked away in the credits at the end, also technical advisors Tom Hewlett and Jerry Schilling. So Tom Hewlett, one of the co-founders of Concerts West, one of the pioneering arena and stadium concert promoters in the 70s, worked with most of the major acts, including Elvis, of course, and Jerry Schilling, who was managing the Beach Boys as well. And he was one of the members of the Memphis Mafia, Gary, that managed to build himself quite a distinguished career outside of that life, but still maintain that life with Elvis. That would have been a major achievement in itself.
Yeah, that was fascinating when I was younger to realize that Jerry was involved with both the Beach Boys and Elvis Presley. I think it's in Heroes and Villains, the book I referenced, that it begins with Brian on the brink of death, basically, and Jerry is quoted as saying, "I watched this happen with Elvis. I don't want it to happen with Brian."
Yeah.
So that connection is quite fascinating, and it is interesting, too. You think of the Memphis Mafia, apart from Elvis, what are... Very few of them were even anything, but Jerry definitely is one of the guys who forged a bit of a career. I believe he worked with Billy Joel as well, and he had a thing unto himself. So good for Jerry. It's good to see his name there.
Yeah, I agree. And also Tom Hewlett, after Concerts West, became a talent manager, Tom Hewlett and Associates, and worked once again with a number of major acts, including the Beach Boys. And of course, there's the Jerry Schilling and Myrna Smith connection, which ties into Carl Wilson's solo work, which we'll allude to later on. Gary, one of the things that I really love about this film is the fact that Malcolm Leo had the courage with the music clips to let them play out to either their entire length or close enough, rather than just brief clips. And that made it a little bit special. And some of the performances and television appearances are just fantastic, and it's great to see them all the way through.
I like that too, because to me it's real... a recent word I've added to my lexicon, ephemeral. It's really of the time, and it gives you a real image of what it was like to sit and watch, whether it was whatever it was, Hullabaloo, Shindig, whatever the show, wherever these clips are from. And you get the sense of this is what the kids were seeing. These performances on television give you right at the moment what it was like, what they were like on stage, what the studio audience was doing and screaming, and how Dennis was swinging his head behind the drum kit, and just how it looked at the moment. It's a dispatch right from the front lines of that moment. And I like to hear the whole song. And quite often I'm okay now, I get the gist. And there is a couple times when Leo will not go right to the very end, give you a little bit of a clip, give you the idea, and move on. So it's a good mix in that respect.
I think it's worth also mentioning that it's easy now to take for granted these compilations because we can just go on YouTube and we can follow an artist's career from beginning to end. But in those days, I mean, from the filmmaker's point of view, actually getting the rights to these clips and assembling them was a huge logistical operation in itself,
Yes.
Phone calls and trips and visits and all of this sort of stuff. But also from our point of view, it's hard to comprehend just how inaccessible all of that was. I mean, the only way we would see something like that without these kind of films, you alluded to a VHS or copy of something, or maybe a late night concert or documentary on TV. But it's just hard to comprehend just how rare and inaccessible all of this material was for so long.
That's true, because this is from mid-'80s. This is from that previous era before whatever, the awakening of the YouTubes and the Googles.
Yeah.
So it was a totally different era where this sort of film loaded with those clips were huge and people would have ate them up for sure.
There's an interesting interview actually with Malcolm Leo from 2003 on documentary.org, and we've put a link to that on the website. It was an interview by Nat Sagaloff, and there's a couple of little interesting points from that interview that we'll go into at the end when we're perhaps talking about whether or not Malcolm Leo managed to achieve what he set out to do and whether or not he did realise his vision for this film. So as we said, they source films from a number of different specials and television shows. Quite a bit was sourced from a 1976 special called The Beach Boys' It's Okay, otherwise The Beach Boys' Good Vibrations Tour, which was actually produced by, it was basically a Saturday Night Live project. It was produced by Lorne Michaels and Gary Weiss, and there's John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd feature in it, and we'll discuss their little clip a little bit later on. It's interesting that they talk about they kind of make brief mention of Murray Wilson and the difficulties of working with him as their manager, some of the rules that he set that they thought were unreasonable, but they kind of leave that whole Murray Wilson situation alone, don't they? I mean, we've gone into what Timothy White referred to as the legacy of pain previously in some detail, but the significance of Murray's or the worst excesses of Murray's behaviour aren't even touched on, are they?
No, they're not. And I had to ponder that while I was rewatching. And sometimes in an article of mine at my website, I will even make mention of, if you're going to touch on something, you either mention it in passing with a sentence or you unlock the box and you let it all come out. So when your story has the scope that the Beach Boys story does, I guess you kind of have to pick what you want to do. I mean, Murray's been talked about a lot in other ridiculous, more TV movies or whatever that came later, because that's dramatic. There's a lot of story there to Murray being the dad, etc., and all of the family issues that they had. But I'm okay with Malcolm Leo skipping that entirely, because it would have been a much longer special, a documentary, and it would have been a different animal. I think it would have taken a different route, and it just would have been a different thing. So I'm okay with not even going there. Let's just stick with, the other things, and we understand about the dark side there, but I'm okay with that. So you have to choose what you're going to talk about and what you're not going to talk about. So that's what Leo did, I suppose.
One of the real joys of the film, I think, are some of the early clips of their early live performances when they're just kids, really. And the sheer joy of those performances, and Brian has really such a lovely, confident stage presence as well. And that's kind of juxtaposed against the image from the mid-70s of Brian in bed, reminiscing, talking about
Yes.
the evolution of the band and the sort of family connections with everybody. The contrast from that young, confident man leading the band to Brian basically lying in bed. Now, he's certainly articulate and he's very interesting to listen to, but it's an interesting contrast.
It is, and it reminds us, it reminds the fans that there was such a small window, I guess. Surfin', the single, came out in 61, but they were big, 62, 63, and then what was it, December of 64, where he had his first kind of episode on the airplane, and there things started to turn. So these early clips, they show him as, of course, a vital, vibrant member of this energetic, vigorous band. And you can tell when he takes a lead on one of the songs that, he's not Mike Love. Thank you for that. He's different than even Dennis Wilson. In terms of energy, he was different from the get-go. But you're right, there is a really small window of when he was really an active member of the group in these TV clips. And the contrast, definitely, as a later man who looks, frankly, he looks totally different later on in the 70s. And it is interesting, and it drives home the breadth of his story and of his arc. And it reminds the viewer that he is such a unique personage. But the early clips really show that small little window when they were all five together and just energetic and just a great performance on these TV shows.
It's interesting, in the documentary, there's no mention of David Marks, although I think you actually see him. There's an image of the group on the beach in their white T-shirts.
Yes.
But he doesn't actually rate a mention. But I sense this is going to be a short conversation.
Yeah, You know what, David Marks, when he came back on the scene, whatever it was now, it's 10 some odd years ago with the anniversary tours, he was really heralded as an original member, a founding member. He'll flesh out the touring band in the 2000s, whatever it was. And a lot of people I maybe read things online or in groups on social media. Everybody is so pleased that he's back in the fold and what happened to him all these years. But if we're going to be honest, this is an extremely minor player in rock history. And to have spent any time discussing his brief tenure when Al Jardine thought it would be better, I guess, to be a dentist for that brief moment would have been a waste of time as well. And it would have been outside the lines of the intention of the documentary. So I don't miss that there's no David Marks in it.
Okay, yeah, and I think that was 2012, wasn't it? One thing that kind of bookends the special is Brian's birthday party, which is worth mentioning, and that's nice. Paul and Linda McCartney are there, and it's nice to see Audrey and Dennis is there, and it's just a nice moment with everyone together, I think.
Well, this footage, I mean, when I was rewatching, I want to see all that footage. I just want to sit and let that play. This is a remarkable thing. And again, in terms of rock history, the relationship between Brian and Paul McCartney is the stuff of legend. And I think I even made a note that when the documentary begins, I mean, maybe the first face you see is Paul McCartney. And you see Paul McCartney, and then you see Dennis's wife, Karen Lamb, and you're thinking, this is such a time capsule. Where is this footage? Give me the whole thing. So that birthday party, yes, I could just sit and watch it the whole time. It is quite a fascinating highlight of this doc.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And you alluded to the song "Surfin'" before, and we hear we hear from Fred Morgan, who was Brian's music teacher, who gave "Surfin'" an F.
The Beach Boys, and I was their music teacher 20-some years ago, were average, red-blooded American young boys. Brian wrote a composition for me, and it turned out to be Surfin'. Well, that Surfin' composition got an F, but it made $1 million.
There is an interesting postscript to that, because in 2018, Brian actually went back to Hawthorne High and he had his grade upgraded to an A. And there's really a lovely article about that in a publication called The Daily Breeze, which we've linked to on the website. And it's just a really nice story about that. The principal of Hawthorne High, Vanessa Landisfind, presented Brian Wilson with a certificate changing the F to the A. She said, this is interesting, he was a good student and athlete. He never failed a class. It was our opportunity to say, you're awesome. We're honoured to have you at the school. And she made the comment that Brian was quiet, didn't say too much, but was very nice, and he had a bit of a tour of the school. And as I said, it's a lovely article, and that to me is just a nice thing.
It is cute and pleasant, and it's I don't want to say it's insignificant because it's a grade from 50 years previous, but it just supports the many stories in rock history of the man, the establishment, the teachers, the record companies, whatever, not really getting what an artist is doing. And perhaps within the scope of the class, well, that wasn't what I wanted, Brian. Here's your F. But of course, this teacher went on to do what? And Brian Wilson is Brian Wilson. So it's a nice little story, yeah.
Yeah. And, when we were hearing the narrative from Brian from his bed, he sort of confesses that he doesn't really like surfing too much, not all that keen on the beach. Would that have been a surprise to people at that time when he said that?
I think it might have been, sure. I think that maybe the band was still young enough in historical terms that maybe people would have thought that they are really, really beach people and they really are surfers and they really are athletic types. But at the same time, I would always say there was always a Southern Californian thing with the Beach Boys. Surfing is just one part of that. So the lifestyle would still have been, they were all participants in that sort of thing. But yeah, this doc is early days enough that I think it might have been interesting to learn that surfing was not really a passion of any of them. I think even Mike Love did it throughout his life, but it wasn't part of their thing. No, so that one might have been surprising. Yes,
I think it was mainly Dennis was I think Brian alluded to the fact that Dennis was really probably the only real surfer, in the band. And of course, apart from surfing, the car culture was another thing. And there's a nice little segment on that. You see Paula Matt and Mackenzie Phillips in that little scene from American Graffiti where he's not all that keen. She thinks the Beach Boys are boss. He's not all that keen on them. But it is quite interesting, actually, to see Carl Wilson arriving at the dealership in his white convertible Bentley to have a look at the all of these hot rods.
Hot rods, yeah. That clip is fascinating too. Now, what is that from? Where's that from? That's really interesting as well.
I think that was also from the 76 Beach Boys. It's okay. I think a lot of those kind of quirky clips were from that.
Well, that makes sense. And the car culture thing was almost given a little bit more screen time than the surfing thing, really. But the car culture thing, you've even read books, Beach Boys books, where it talks about even, kids in Kansas could relate to a car, whereas surfing was a little bit more far afield. But the car part of the Beach Boys is huge, yeah. And Carl, it was good that they chose Carl to be featured in that segment. That was interesting as well, yeah. And of course, the American Graffiti part is great because I would have seen the Beach Boys, an American band, years before I saw American Graffiti. So that was kind of fun for me. And little Mackenzie Phillips is the surfer girl, her Dewey Weber t-shirt she has on, surfboard manufacturer. Yeah. So that was a fun clip to throw in there. It made perfect sense.
There's an interesting clip there from a Bob Hope special. And I think, that's Jack Benny with Bob Hope?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, and that's quite interesting. The Beach Boys do California Girls, and then they do a little bit of a comedy skit afterwards, and Bob Hope and Jack Benny are sort of in stupid wigs trying to look hip. There's a nice little sketch with some generation gap humour, and I know this kind of thing doesn't always go down well with people, and you maybe roll their eyes a little bit. But I actually really like that. I think that's really nice. Bob Hope, in particular, was having so much fun doing it, you could tell.
I thought it was a good clip, too. I mean, generation gap, you're right. But my funny thing is that, I'm fluent in Jack Benny's radio shows as well as the Beach Boys. So it was a good mashup for me.
Yeah.
It really was great footage. It was sparkling color. It looked really great. A couple of things I noticed was Mike Love's shirt. I would love to have that. Dennis Wilson. It's one of the 1,000 reminders that when you really look at the boys in the band, he is the only one that looked cool from day one to the very end. He looked good in every iteration of his face, his facial hair, his hair, his clothing. He always looked spectacular. You couldn't keep your eyes off him. And people are not going to really know this about Jack Benny, maybe, but his big thing was that he was a cheapskate. So if you'll notice that it's interesting that when they run down the dues for this surfing club, when he says it back to them, he talks, so I get all this for $14.50, when really they had said $17.50.
Oh.
So he's trying to save those $3, which older viewers at the time would have known, oh, Jack Benny the cheapskate. So it's pretty clever sketch.
No, I really like that, I must say. We get to the point now where they do talk about Brian's breakdown and his withdrawal from the road. This is kind of spun in a positive way in that it allows him to get into the studio and really allow his creativity to flourish. And Dennison talks very passionately about just how great Pet Sounds is. Carl talks about how Brian could detect small errors in multi-instrumental pieces, right away.
The true scope of Brian's mental challenges and the reasons for his retreat are not really touched on because, again, if you're going to go there, you got to really go there. And this becomes an event that takes place over the course of 5 nights, an hour a night. But I like, too, a documentary like this gives you sort of the peaks and the high points and almost the bullet points, and it makes the viewer curious about what isn't being talked about. Well, what's the deal with the dad? Why is Brian in bed? So it almost gives you, here's what you need to know about the Beach Boys. And I hope that you're encouraged to seek out the things that we're not able to talk about here.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And Brian, I remember reading that when Brian told the boys he was not going to tour with them anymore, they were more than distraught. Somebody threw an ashtray and somebody was crying. And I remember not really being able to understand what the problem was. Bands are kind of fluid and there's touring bands and session musicians and everything. What is the big deal? But it drives home the idea that they were a family, they were a tight-knit unit. They had security in the 5 of them being together through all their maneuverings, their television shows, their tours, their live performances, their recordings. So when Brian, and you can't tell me that the other 4 were not fully aware that he was driving the bus. So when he says, I'm stepping back, it would have thrown them off for any number of reasons. Dennis and Carl, maybe the love of their brother. Others in the band, maybe, what about our success as a band if you retreat? So at least they touch on the idea that this was unique too, like the Beatles ceasing live performances, unique steps. One of the band members says, no, I'm going to create the music here in the studio. You guys go be the band. So that's a fascinating aspect of the Beach Boys story. And like you say, Dennis talks about how that might as well, that's what he should have been doing, because he could hear things in bar 32 or that cellist hit the wrong string, or I sense that the bass player was up till 2:30 last night because he's not playing correctly. Brian would know these things. So put your aces in the places and have Brian do what he did so well. And that's a fascinating part of the Beach Boys story. I'm glad they touched on that.
Okay, so we're heading towards Smile now. And Brian talks about working with collaborators, cites Van Dyke Parks being his favourite collaborator at that time. Mm-hmm. Van Dyke Parks does make an appearance in the movie, but not quite sure that he really does himself any great justice in that, to be honest.
Well, this whole section, you talk about a mini-series as opposed to a doc. You could drill down on Pet Sounds' Smile era for days. And a lot of the footage, too, of them, whether they're rehearsing or they're recording, a lot of the changes in their appearance, with maybe it's the aviator glasses or 3-day beards, or Carl Wilson with his sunglasses on, and I think he's playing a Hofner bass at one time. I remember hearing a clip from Pet Sounds, going back a little bit, Here Today was a song I had never heard before in my life before seeing this doc for the first time. So to see them working these things out and to see them going into this era is fascinating. Brian talks about combining elements of Bach with elements of Phil Spector, and you're just smiling, thinking to yourself, this is why we love Brian Wilson. Bach and Phil Spector, his combining of harmonics and rock and roll. And then when you get to Smile and Van Dyke, I love Van Dyke. I think he is a Southern gentleman, very erudite, very smart, but it's funny how he talks about the lyrics, and he mentions the American Gothic trip, he says, quote unquote, that they were on, which maybe it's another podcast to discuss Smile, whether it would have actually gained the rep that it has today if it had been released at the time is a subject for discussion. But I like that he mentions it in a goofy way their surfing lyrics, hang 10, dingwitty pearl, whatever he says.
Yes.
And now we're going
Yes.
to over and over the crow cries, uncover the cornfield.
Yeah.
And it's a simple sort of a goofy way. And look where he's standing. Is he not on Sunset outside Tower Records? I mean, what a perfect spot to interview him. But he says, the lyrics were out there. It was an American Gothic trip. And he even is self-deprecating enough to say, so I told them, if these don't make any sense, throw the lyrics out. And he says, and so they did. So
And they did.
You all know that Smile didn't work out. And he mentions, of course, it was Mike Love that came to him, explain this to me. So as soon as you want the lyric explained, as soon as you want the David Lynch film explained, as soon as you want the poetry explained, you don't get it. So Van Dyke was not about to, explain all the trip they were on. And you could tell that it was just splintering. And Van Dyke seems to encapsulate that in the goofy little 90 seconds that he has.
Yeah. Brian confesses at this point or admits at this point that he was really being messed up by various drugs. The session became quite dark. It sort of became a bit out of control. They're burning wood in the studio for the fire effect and wearing firemen's helmets, and Brian gets into his mind because of the paranoia and the effect of some of the drugs that he's taking, that they were somehow responsible for a real fire that was happening in a warehouse some way away from the studio. So the project is abandoned, and Brian once again withdraws from public life. But Gary, there's just something that you might be able to help me with here that I didn't quite understand. Carl is talking about the Monterey Festival that they were set to headline.
Brian withdrew from public life completely. We were supposed to headline the Monterey Pop Festival, but at the last minute Brian backed out. Monterey was a turning point in rock and roll. Overnight the whole scene changed, and we felt as if we'd been passed by.
He says the image of the Beach Boys was out of sync with the times. It was real rough on the group. Brian wasn't around to help, and if we were going to survive, we had to do it alone. But I just wonder, given that they had been touring without Brian and obviously had a very accomplished touring band, why did Brian's withdrawal after Smile stop them playing at Monterey?
Well, this is such a fascinating mini little segment of their career, and there's so much great footage leading up to this Monterey talk. I mean, Brian at the piano playing Surf's Up, I think it was a Leonard Bernstein special. For people that love Brian Wilson, I mean, this moment in his home, it's spellbinding in a way. And to hear Brian talk about the fire sessions you referenced, hear him say in such understated terms, as we know down the line where his head was at and the struggles that he was having. And for him to say in 76, Brian, whenever that one interview is from, the way he says, I was in a very strange bag at the time. He kind of chuckles at himself. And I was getting pretty far out by then. The way he sort of drops these little explanations about what happened. The footage from the fire sessions, this too, back in the mid-'80s when, aside from bootlegs, I guess, there was very little Smile music out there to be heard. To hear this and to see whatever this promotional clip they might have made at the time with the fire truck and the fire hats, that is riveting too. And to juxtapose that with She's Real Fine, My 409 and the Happiness songs, this makes you wonder too, what the Beach Boys, what's going on here? Where did they go with this fire music? Fascinating. So that leads us into the Monterey thing. And I've thought about that too in the past, because you might quickly say, well, they might have still been considered a surf band at the time, and that wasn't the type of music that was featured at Monterey. But Monterey is a unique animal because, I mean, never mind, it wasn't all hippie stuff at Monterey. I mean, it's so famous for being a coming out party for Otis Redding. Lou Rawls was there, Ravi Shankar, the Blues Project. They would have, I guess, fit in might not be the right word, but that part wouldn't have precluded them from going there. I got to go back to maybe Brian telling the boys he's not touring with them, he's staying in the studio, and how shook up they got. There might have been a lack of self-confidence. There might have been that's going to be a pretty wild world for us to go into. And now maybe the perception is, with losing the through line, the spine of Brian Wilson through our music and through our rep, that makes us look maybe a little bit vulnerable, lacking in self-confidence. When think about the Beach Boys without Brian Wilson, I mean, we can discuss that too. And at this time, 67, when probably the press and the general consensus was Brian is shutting down, Brian is pulling back, Brian maybe is done and can't do this anymore, to have made that big, bold leap to perform at Monterey with Jimi Hendrix lighting things on fire, it might have been a big ask for the Beach Boys to say, I mean, look at these clips with the striped shirts and all that, and they're such passive looking guys. Maybe there was a feeling of it, I mean, I don't know, I'm just conjecturing. Maybe there was a feeling of, I don't know, man, like we are in a bad, funny place here. And I remember reading that Brian was maybe even honorarily put on what was called, I guess, a board of directors for Monterey Pop. He was a consultant type thing. Whether or not he was ever really consulted, it was more of a stamp of approval thing. Brian is part of our planning thing. And that was obviously elevating Brian to a certain place. So without him in the band, it might have been just a confidence, a lack of, we're not sure of where we're going forward. It's a big loss too. I think they could have performed in such a way, and they would have had enough of a catalog that it would have been more than acceptable. But it's lamentable that happened, and that was obviously a bit of a turning point in the Beach Boys' arc.
So we hear from Bruce Johnson now. He came in to the touring band replacing Glenn Campbell. Talks about how they were very much out of favour, played to crowds as small as 200 in New York, but then have a real resurgence in their career in the UK and Europe. There's lots of fabulous footage from their personal appearances and out and about having fun, kind of recaptured the youthful joy of the earlier years, I think. Just really, really great stuff there. And they went across the Iron Curtain to Czechoslovakia. And there's a scene there. I mean, they've got a huge welcome there. And we see Al Jardine in the back of the car signing a couple of arms. And it's interesting because you, in our previous episode, you talked about your great story about meeting the Beach Boys backstage at Canada's Wonderland. And you actually referenced that scene to Al Jardine, didn't you? And he was surprised that you even knew about it because he couldn't remember or didn't know where the footage was.
This is a whole fascinating little mini segment, and it speaks of Europe. The U.S., I guess, is the place to be popular, the place to do your thing, but there's such a ruthless machine there, and the audiences are so fickle, and they take from you what they want, and then when there's any little bit of a blip or any little bit of a thing, they move on to something else. But it seems like the UK, and the same has been obvious through the 60s with American bluesmen having a resurgence going overseas. Even a guy like Del Shannon, Roy Orbison, once the hits sort of dry up in the States, they go to the UK and they can start all over again. They're huge over there. And so it's no surprise the Beach Boys are huge over there. You see, like you say, a lot of great footage. Like it's interesting to look at where they're performing. That might have been some old opera house, because what kind of venues would there be in Prague or whatever at the time? But fascinating footage. I did notice it's funny that maybe a lot of the footage, there's video and then there's audio, and they don't necessarily match sometimes. Yeah, I think I see a couple of things like that used to frustrate me as a kid. Why isn't, I hear the drums, the snare drum, why is he not? But that's neither here nor there. It was still interesting footage. It is a whole separate story, but when you meet these people that you've loved for so long, you always conjecture sitting around the basement with your friends, what would you say to so-and-so if you met him? So when I walked up to Al Jardine, I mean, the first thing I thought of was, here I am walking up to him, can you sign this? And right away I thought, well, I remember him in Prague sitting in the back of the car. And I suppose it was his wife with him. And he was nice and gentle and passive like Al's always been. And, when I asked him to sign it, I didn't, really know what else to say. And I said, I've seen footage of you signing people's arms in Czechoslovakia back in the 60s. And he seemed quite surprised. And he really? Like, where'd you see that? And his wife sort of nudged him, as all wives do when men don't have a clue what they're talking about. And she said, it's in that documentary. And maybe he did remember, maybe he didn't. But he said, oh, yeah, okay. He thought maybe I was some filmmaker or whatever. But you know what? To me, that speaks to, I don't know if it's a vacuum necessarily, but these artists, they do their thing. They're creating, they got a job to do that takes up all their life, and they don't know necessarily there's a camera in their face or there's a documentary being made or there's news footage or clips. So he would not be as aware of that footage as we are, certainly, because he was touring, he was performing, and he moves along. Whereas us, we see that footage and we think it's amazing. So it's funny the difference between the fan and the artist. He didn't remember that, whereas it's burned in my brain.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so they have a great time in Europe and they come back and they really start, I guess, their resurgence in the US. We then see some footage from a 1971 television special, Good Vibrations from Central Park, with the Beach Boys and the Byrds. They do student demonstration time. But my favourite from there is Okie from Muskogee. And all these hippies are having so much fun singing Okie from Muskogee, which is kind of the absolute opposite to anything that they stand for. Wonderful. It's just great.
I'm no sociologist, but there's something to be gleaned here from what's going on. Like, again, how transient the American public is with their tastes. So there's a blip in the Beach Boys' acceptance by mainstream audiences, but now they've got a bit of a rep again, and I guess they look more the part now with their beards and their hair and their clothes. And what are they going to sing in a concert setting like this? Surf and Safari, or do they have to dig for a certain? So to get a bit of a tongue-in-cheek Okie from Muskogee, maybe they were winking at the audience. We're all in on this.
I think they were. I think they were.
So it's a fun sort of thing. Yeah. So there's almost a bit of a resurgence here. You're right. And they're kind of, they're okay again type thing,
Yeah. And Al sounds fantastic on Heroes and Villains there. That's just a great version of that.
For sure.
And the crowd are just, they've got the crowd absolutely in the palms of their hands. It's quite, because you sort of, I don't know, there's something about this film. You're sort of on their side, aren't you? You sort of want them to, when they're really hitting it out of the park, you're sort of saying, way to go, come on, we want you to be successful. You really feel invested in how they're going.
That's for sure. And maybe 71 is so early days. Maybe that was the beginning of audiences looking back to 10 years previous when I was in high school or whatever. So maybe there's a nostalgia already for the Beach Boys. So when you're current and trying to make records, we're done with you. We're listening to Hendrix or whatever. But give it 2 or 3 years. Now I can look back on that day in high school with the Beach Boys. Now I love them because I can kind of reminisce. They're part of my growing up. So that was starting to happen already in 71, maybe.
Of course, by 74, Endless Summer, the compilation album comes out, is a massive hit, and they become this stadium band once again. And Brian is improving. He's talking about how with the help of his wife, his brothers, mother, and friends, and his doctor. And it's interesting that Eugene Landy is not mentioned by name, but his name is in the credits, just hidden in the thanks to section of the credits. Brian basically said, for 3.5 years, he experimented himself right out of action. But even when he's in bed, he's articulate and he's interesting to listen to, and he just comes across as very, very nice.
I made notes about that self-awareness. It's such a fascinating little mini moment in Brian's arc. And I do believe that Landy came on the scene and righted the ship somewhat, and then he was gone again. And then when he came back in more the early 90s, that was when it got to be really controversial. So he did do a bit of a job on Brian, and Brian was aware enough. And to hear this bit bear of a man talk about, and your sympathy goes out to him because he's touching on it lightly like I had a bad day. Whereas we know down the line, that the man suffered almost every day of his life. The concept of hearing voices in your head, when you consider that that's how some poor people live, the challenges of that. I mean, and to think that Brian was still able to function and make music, even though he suffered like this. So to hear him talk about it is really fascinating. And there's a bit of a family moment I have to mention when they talk about, I believe it was more 76-ish, Brian is back with us on stage, blah, blah. And you see Brian playing at a keyboard. You don't know how engaged he is or not. He doesn't look certainly that engaged. The shot lasts about 4 or 5 seconds. Brian is playing at the piano, whatever he's doing, and he turns his head to the right slightly. And there's a bit of a rack focus where into focus comes Dennis Wilson sitting at the drum kit. And he's just looking at Brian. There's a moment where Brian, maybe who knows where he is mentally at that moment, but he looks over at Dennis and Dennis is looking at him. And it's so touching because you get the sense that Dennis knows this, my big brother, this poor guy, he shouldn't be here. We've dragged, maybe he feels partly guilty. Maybe he's mad at Mike, whatever. We've dragged him out here. He's not really ready for this, but that moment where he's captured looking at Brian is so touching. So there's this moment in the late 70s where Brian is able to talk about his troubles. He's so lucid, and he's hitting on these things in such small terms when we know there's big stuff going on. It's great footage.
And, as the special sort of comes to an end and we sort of get towards the 80s, he's looking slim and looking fantastic. And, that's great to see. But just one thing I did want to ask you about, and this is another one from the Saturday Night Live special, Good Vibrations Tour, or It's Okay, whichever title you want to use. And Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi turn up as sort of surf patrol. They're fantastic. Of course, Dan Aykroyd does the authoritative police officer extremely well, and they basically drag Brian down to the beach and throw him into the surf on a surfboard. And it's kind of funny, but is it in retrospect? Is it just a nice piece of Brian having a bit of a laugh at a good-natured laugh at his own expense, or perhaps now looking back with what we perhaps maybe understand a little bit better about mental illness, is it maybe a little bit disturbing, or am I just reading too much into what just should be a nice light-hearted moment?
It made perfect sense, no doubt, to audiences of the day, because Lorne Michaels and Belushi and Aykroyd, I mean, they knew how to do such things, and this is comical. I love the footage inside Brian's home. I mean, how often do you see the hallway walking into his bedroom?
Yeah.
I love that, and it makes perfect sense. In terms of Brian and the boys, their rep at the time was Brian was reclusive, whatever you want to say. So the plot point of we get him out of bed and we get him surfing because people love you and you need to be Brian Wilson. This is the Beach Boys. What are you doing in bed? Let's go. So it's comical and they're the surf squad, whatever. Audiences of the day, great. But it's heartbreaking to see.
Yeah.
I don't want to reference Brian's book, Wouldn't It Be Nice? Because we know how fraught with whatever that particular biography is. But I believe it's in that book that he mentions this scenario of him shooting this special and getting dragged out to the beach. Dr. Landy encouraging him to go through with it and get out there and fight his demons. But Brian, when he's done with it, he's soaked and he's disgusted and he's cursing Landy and he's disgusted with the whole thing. The whole 76 Brian is Back campaign is so fraught with exploitation that it is heartbreaking. The band by that point knew that we're a legacy act now, thanks to Endless Summer. We can always do that, but we still have music in us, and we wanted to get out there. We want to make new music. But record companies, audiences, nobody really cares much unless Brian Wilson's involved. So what do? They get Brian Wilson involved. I don't care what he's feeling, what he's thinking, where he is in his brain or his health or his mind. We need him to continue as a band. So it might be a big indictment on the other guys, and we can talk about that too. It's not necessarily they're all villains, but it was premature, to say the least, to get Brian back in the studio. Definitely premature to throw the guy in the ocean with his robe on. It's heartbreaking, really, and there's a lot of sad stories in rock and roll, a lot of sad things that happen to people that shouldn't have happened. But this one here, with the context that we have now, watching that is is not my favorite. It's exploitative. And, I don't want to go overboard because, okay, they're a band and they're a viable commodity still, and he's a major part of that brand. So get him out there. I kind of get that. And he gave us 15 Big Ones, an album that I love. But for a special like that, he clearly wasn't ready for that. And it is tough to watch if you know anything about Brian Wilson.
We now move to a couple of the solo projects. We see some great footage of Dennis in the studio working on Pacific Ocean Blue. And Carl talks about his rock and roll sensibilities, which he was, I guess, a little frustrated that he couldn't quite be as boisterous as he wanted to. So he has this great collaboration with Myrna Smith through the Jerry Schilling connection, of course, because they were together at that time and were subsequently married.
Yeah, I mean, this is fascinating too. It's interesting they didn't touch on any of Mike Love's solo endeavors, I guess.
No.
But anyways, Dennis, the clip of him in the studio with that song from his record, I mean, that was revelatory for me at the time. It's a magnificent record, and Dennis's solo work is a story unto itself. And it's hard to listen to the music when the man is on screen. Is he the best looking thing I've ever seen in 1977? Not only handsome, but cool. Carl's records are interesting too. Dennis, boy, I don't know if I'm done. I can talk about how wonderful the man looked.
Yeah.
But anyways,
yeah.
Carl, his two records, they are interesting and they are pretty solid and pretty good. I think they're lacking a little something, but to have a chance to go out and to do your own thing, I can certainly understand that. And a guy like Carl Wilson, he should have did his own thing apart from the Beach Boys, had a solo career and been successful. Listen to the man's voice. His production abilities, he's just wonderful. I do believe that one clip they show is from the popular show Solid Gold back in the day, which was, even though it was the 80s, they were still committed to lip syncing. So it's not the best footage, but it gives you the idea of the record. So, and to have him interviewed to talk about his role in the Beach Boys versus what he would want to do, and that's another Pandora's box we could open up about individuals in a band. Did they have success as solo acts? Did they have something to say? Would anybody have bought their records? So not many bought, Carl's music. Dennis's has a immense rep, and it was popular at the time too. So that's an interesting segment they put in there.
And Myrna Smith, of course, was a member of the Sweet Inspirations,
yes,
who played with Elvis, which was the interesting connection through Jerry Schilling. So we're getting now towards the 1980s.
If I could just add one thing, I took a minute to just dump on Mike Love, but it's fascinating. At this moment in the doc, he's interviewed and he says the fragmentation doesn't work and the specialization doesn't work.
Yes.
We've learned that
Yeah.
we must all stay together. I guess what he doesn't say, but what you and I hear, George, is, Mike, do not leave me alone. I cannot do this by myself. I can't do anything alone. I need the Beach Boys. And he spins it as, we're a band and the fragmentation doesn't work and the specialization. You know what? He might have been right. But when it comes from Mike Love, it smacks of a little something that you kind of snicker at. But there's also clips from this same moment. He's got a gold lame jacket on or something. I mean, come on. Got to give him credit. With Mick Jagger, he is the quintessential front man. I mean, he does.
Oh, he is. I absolutely agree.
He does that so well. So not to dump on him, he was an essential player in this band. Interesting to hear him say, though, we need to be a band and stick together. Yeah, well, of course you do.
I really noticed that comment as well. So we're getting to this. So they're playing massive shows, hundreds of thousands of people, 4th of July, America's band. Secretary of the Interior, James Watt, however, is not really a fan.
Over the last 3 years, as many as 500,000 people converged on the Washington Monument to celebrate America's birthday. The Beach Boys were the main event for 2 of those years, but Interior Secretary James Watt says the Beach Boys are a hard rock band and inappropriate for the 4th of July. The reason for the trouble, according to Watt, is that rock bands were attracting the wrong element.
I've just called in Ambassador Phil Habib to settle the Jim Watt Beach Boy controversy.
The president is a friend of the Beach Boys, and he likes them, and I'm sure when I get to meet him, I'll like them.
We're very honored and proud to have you here at the White House, which is everybody's house. We were looking forward to seeing them on the 4th of July. I'm glad they got here early.
I actually thought President Reagan just handled that so well, just with the right amount of diplomacy and levity. Presented James Watt with a shooting himself in the foot trophy, and it was all resolved gracefully.
Yeah, and it's interesting. James Watt, I mean, foolish, I suppose, but
yeah,
I guess that maybe his concern was speaking more towards the crowds that would have been there as opposed to the Beach Boys themselves. I mean,
yes, I think so, yeah.
You can't say the Beach Boys ever really encouraged any debauchery or even drug taking or whatever. But, you know, the crowds, but I guess he missed the fact that they were, by that point, even a real part of the fabric of American life. The kids loved them. And I think that some of the footage, some of the shots of the crowds, the size of the crowds, I think anytime that number of people are together, you're going to have things happening, whatever. So he decided, and a side note is a subject I'm working on right now. He brought in Wayne Newton for a couple of years to quell the insanity and So Wayne brought his act to the Capitol there, and he was a good friend of Reagan's as well. So like you say, you know, Reagan did, I'm sure he did a lot of things well, and handling that, he didn't give it too much weight that somebody would have said, what are you wasting your time on this for? A little bit of a joke about it, and it was big enough because it was a huge event, you know, at a government type site. So he did talk about it enough, but it just shows that the people loved the Beach Boys. They were part of the American experience. And to have them be endorsed by the highest office, no matter who's sitting in the chair, I think that speaks volumes as well. We need them here. They mean something to these people and to us. So it's a great stamp that they got at that time.
And we get to quite I guess it's a bittersweet ending to the documentary. You know, we can see that through some of the stage footage that poor Dennis is really struggling now. We see his last appearance with the band, the last time that they were all together in Atlantic City. And you can see that Dennis is struggling during that show, although, you know, still gracious and very, very nice. And of course, then we have the news reports of Dennis's death and the press conference. You know, once again, all handled with so much dignity when that mattered.
Yeah, you know, the Dennis part, it's speaking of heartbreaking, there's a lot of things in rock and roll that just really bum you out. And Dennis Wilson is right up there. I mean, is so cool, so handsome, and so gifted, but it was the perfect sort of combination of his giftings so did not suit his persona and the persona of the band. A lot of his music is so austere and contemplative and deep, to use a bad term. But people don't understand that because he's Dennis Wilson, handsome surfer, Beach Boys. He never had that outlet, which I'm sure contributed to his troubles. And to see him, as you say, in the latter stages of his life is sad. A quick aside: there's a moment at that one concert when Carl and Brian are sharing a microphone. Again, talk about looks between brothers. Carl sort of is looking up at his taller brother with a bit of a look of affection. And the Dennis part is so sad, and the presser afterwards, when they announce it, is quite sad as well. You can tell Brian is, you know, Brian doesn't want to, he actually abruptly stops and says, I don't want to talk about it anymore. But you watch Carl at that moment. Carl has to pick up the ball and run with it, and he's distraught as well. This is his brother. And he has to talk about that. It's a tough moment, and you always ask yourself, why? Like the nice story of the Beach Boys. I mean, a lot of bad stuff too, but you know, why does Dennis have to die? So, but of course they go on, and you know, they're able to carry on. But it's a sad moment for sure.
It sort of ends on quite an optimistic note. You know, 500,000 people turning up to concerts, the 4th of July celebrations, and we're going to continue because Dennis would have wanted us to. So it kind of does have that bittersweet ending, but kind of ends on this nice optimistic note as well, where you go away thinking, yeah, you know what? Go get them.
Yeah. The story of the Beach Boys is filled with bummer things, poor Brian, and then there's Murray, and there's No Smile and there's Dennis Dying and all these things that are really rocky road. But I don't know, in terms of reverence, in terms of historical music figures, I mean, people love the Beach Boys, people from multiple generations, scholar types can point to Brian and to Pet Sounds, and fans can point to the outdoor concerts and the good times and the beach party vibe. So to end on the positive was the only way to end, because you should end there, because at the end of the day, their story is about joy, and it's about what they brought to people for so long. I mean, you can discuss all the things about the way they are now and Mike versus Brian and blah, blah, blah. And most rock stories have those type of things. But that's where it should have ended, because they did perform to crowds of that size. They were venerated. They were, I mean, I always talk on my site about the victory lap. When has the artist been able to come back years later and do something significant? Well, the Beach Boys started their victory lap like in 1974, and they're still enjoying it. They're still saying, okay, currently we're not doing much that you're interested in, but what we have done like lasts forever, and you love us, and we have this relationship. And that's where it should have ended, because they're still touring in many different forms today. They still kind of matter in a nostalgic sense. And I wondered where it would end, because there is more to talk about after that point. But you might as well tie it up in a bow there and say, they still tour, people still love them. They are significant, these guys. So I'm fine with the ending.
Let's just revisit this interview that I referenced earlier on. And as I said, we've linked to that from the webpage. And a couple of interesting things came out of that. Now, Nat Sagaloff did the interview. He asked, how objective can you be when you require the permission of your subject, such as with the Beach Boys? He says, the essential relationship with artists is linked to the understanding of the undertaking. When I undertook the Beach Boys, an American band, the last thing I wanted to do was make a puff piece on the Beach Boys. I think he sort of did in a way, but it's an enjoyable and it's a nice puff piece, and I don't think there's anything too far wrong with that, to be honest.
No, there's not too far wrong. We've already touched on this. Like, what are the, when you sit down with a piece of paper, I want to make a doc about the Beach Boys, what am I going to talk about? You realize you could have a list of 75 things. Well, you need to be concise, and you need to keep people's interest through your 90 minutes or however long it's going to be. So you got to pick your stuff. So I guess to not talk about the real negatives, people will say that's a puff piece. But I think we have to define puff piece too. This is not a lightweight thing. This is a story about a band. And just because he didn't touch on the darkness, that might have sent you off on a different, you lose a bit of the cohesion if you start rambling about Maharishi and some of the craziness that happened, whether it's Charles Manson or Brian's actual mental illness that he managed to survive all this time with. That becomes a different animal. So the precision of the doc, I'm totally fine with. Does that make it a puff piece? I don't think so.
Another interesting question Malcolm Leo was asked, did you actually have it in writing that you would have the right of final cut? He said, I thought I had it in writing. There was something they asked me to take out. Brian Wilson was very open about his personal dilemma with drugs and wanted the whole story to be told straight, without pulling any punches. There was a line when he said, I was smoking hash in the studio and so were the boys. And one of the other Beach Boys said, you got to take out so were the boys. And I did. So who do we reckon that might have been, Gary?
Well, I know where you're going with that, and I tend to agree. But at the same time, I don't know. It's a funny thing because drugs aren't even really talked about too much in the doc. It's mentioned that Brian was in a very strange bag, and the drugs, I love the quote, he says, LSD, quote, tore my head off. That always stayed with me. So I don't know what would have been the harm, I guess. I mean, I think we all assume that almost all rock stars got into that, but I guess Mike Love maybe would have wanted to excise that from his rep, his thing about peace and love and health and all that. So yeah, that's an interesting one to have cut out of the doc for sure. But like I say, it wasn't like there's this big gaping hole there because drugs wasn't really touched on a whole lot.
I sort of, love this film. I think if you're a Beach Boys fan and you love the Beach Boys and you see this film, you're going to love them even more. If
Sure.
this is all you know about the Beach Boys, if you're a Beach Boys fan and this is all you know about them, I think it's enough. All of the members are presented in, they're very nice gentlemen, very well mannered.
Yes.
As I said, in a time when that really counted for something. It reflects on them all very well. It touches on some of the complications and the negatives. As you said, they don't mention Manson. They kind of don't really go in any depth into Murray Wilson. We get to see that nice party scene with Audrey and everyone together, that wonderful bond. And I know we talked about this in Beach Boys Book Club as well, but this wonderful bond between the brothers that is so evident on stage, and the three of them, the love that the three of them have for each other is just endlessly endearing.
There's an interview at the very tail end. I think it's the last thing you see. Brian is interviewed. He's looking great. It's at that moment. This is, I guess, mid-80s where he's fit-ish and he's looking great. He's speaking well. He was lucid at looking back in 76 era. He's even more so here. And he says something that is on the surface quite nothing, but it always really resonated with me in terms of its larger connotations of life and the Beach Boys specifically. He says that, and he says it in such, he always had a great conversational tone. He always has sort of talked like a teenager still from the early 60s, which is part of what we love about him. He says that we started out as little babies and we grew into men, the way he says that. And that's a dramatic story, he says. It's the story of the Beach Boys. It's a dramatic story. And that quick little nothing phrase always resonated with me because to me, he's saying the Beach Boys in itself is a dramatic story because we are a family. We started young and we grew, and you were all there front row center while we grew. But I always carried that over into my own life, simply going. Like I always talk about the coming of age film or that pivot point of life, simply going from being a child, a teenager, and pivoting into adulthood. That's a dramatic story. Well, what do you mean? What happened to you? Nothing happened to me. I just grew up. I became a man. I became an adult. I became a woman. That is significant. And so to have Brian Wilson align with me on my thinking that just growing up into adulthood is very dramatic. And this aligns me with Brian, it seems. It aligns me with the Beach Boys because they traveled the same arc that I did. And I just didn't want this to go by without mentioning how much that was significant to me, that he seems to acknowledge it. Yes, life is very dramatic and it's serious. But when you have a companion like Brian and the Beach Boys, it makes things easier.
Yeah, that's a great point. Great point. Totally agree. Really, it was just a great film, and it was an enjoyable film, and I'm so glad to have actually reacquainted myself with it, and I think I like it even more than I did previously.
Yeah, certainly nobody in the band is misrepresented at all, really, and things. I wouldn't even say things are glossed over. The Beach Boys infighting and the things that happened are not super crazy that you're watching this and this, I cannot believe he didn't mention this or didn't mention that. It's such a big part of their story. It's not a doc like that. And like you say, if somebody is curious and saying, I know zero about the Beach Boys, or even worse, if somebody has a perception about them. Oh yeah, surfing, right? Well, yes, but this is a fine place to start. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit biased because it's kind of where I started, but it certainly wets your whistle to learn more. And you might even say, well, I thought there was this, or I thought there was Manson. And it takes you to the next level. It takes you to books, to the internet, to the library, whatever. It takes you to other things. But in terms of here's the story of the Beach Boys, I think it does it, I would say, perfectly well. I mean, what does it really leave out in terms of the arc of their career? I think it does really well. And like you say, it had been a while since I had seen this. And it's a good reminder that there's some great footage. It uses songs, like I said here today, it uses Surf's Up. and it uses a little snippet of Going On, songs that I didn't, you maybe, if they're not on Endless Summer or they're not on the basic greatest hits, maybe you don't know those songs. So this also digs a little bit deeper with giving you some, a couple of deep cuts. So it really does well with staying on the surface, but also digging a little bit deeper to give you some of those good tracks and the great footage. So it's a good, solid place to start.
Well, thank you, Gary. This has been an absolute pleasure and a joy to talk about this wonderful film with you.
Well, it was a pleasure for me, too, to revisit this film and to talk with you, George. I think we presented the film as it should have been presented, and hopefully people will want to seek it out.
And we really do hope you enjoyed this episode. After the credits, there's a little more, and we have some supporting images and links on this episode's dedicated webpage at DEC4podcast.com. Special thanks to Gary Wells, to Gainesville, and to Steve Collins. Check out Steve's travel videos on YouTube at Steve Collins Traveller, formerly Please Tell Me Where to Go. And thank you for listening. Podcast terms and conditions can be found at our website, DEC4podcast.com. You can contact us there or on our social media. Find us on the major podcasting platforms, and we're also on Substack, Facebook, Tumblr, and Instagram. This has been George Fairbrother. Thanks for listening. By the way, it's the 40th anniversary of Beach Boys American Band, which is a great time to be doing the special, but it's only by pure luck that we did it and through no planning at all.
Oh, I had it all planned out, George. That was all me.
Well, I'm glad one of us is,
No.
On the ball. It's just a little interesting when they do the postscript at the end. There's a little note that Mike Love is still practicing transcendental meditation, except I don't think there was any mention of transcendental meditation.
No, so you might have been saying still. Yeah. What are you talking about?
So I wonder if that might have been cut out or something, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. It's a bit comical, too, that, Brian Wilson is revered today. He's the man. Everybody loves him. Mike, he still meditates.
Yeah.
It's the juxtaposition of those two things. Like, Brian is loved. Mike, what do we say about Mike? He meditates. That's about all we got to say about Mike. So it's interesting. They didn't even need those postscripts, really, but it's interesting to tag that on.
But as you said about Mike, on a good night, he is such a fantastic MC and frontman.
Think about it. Think about without him, who's gonna speak to the crowd? Who's gonna engage? I've rolled my eyes, George, out of my head sometimes with his goofiness and the stupid things he says, and his need to put stupid actions to lyrics. Like, she drove her car and he's doing like a steering wheel. Yep. He's such a goof, but you need that. Yeah. You need that, something to focus your eyes on. Brian's not going to do that.
Yeah.
Nobody else is going to do that. So he was, let's face it, man, he was essential to the Beach Boys, so we'll give him some props there, and that's it. River Song. You know what? A quick little story. In the early 90s, a buddy and I traveled across the border into New York State, and there at a record store was Dennis's solo record, Pacific Ocean Blue. And I had it in my hand on CD, and I said, you know what, though? Back home, I've already placed an order at my local record store. The guy's going to order it for me. I don't want to buy this and then have two of them. So I didn't buy it. I got home, and a couple weeks later, the guy said, sorry, I can't get the album for you. So I had it in my hand, didn't buy it, and then couldn't get it. And then there was a time when the album was unavailable to buy it anyway. Eventually, I did buy it, and it was... You know what? A sad memory was... I know that I owned the movie poster for a time. Why I would ever get rid of such a thing, George? I like to think maybe it's tucked away in one of my archives here or something. Surely I wasn't that idiotic, but I did do some dumb things back in the day. I'm sorry, can you hear that stupid phone ringing?
No.
Oh, shoot, okay.
No, I can't hear it. It's no problem.
You might have to edit me out saying that then, sorry.
I'll say that for bloopers reel.
Oh my gosh. George, just give me 1 second here, this stupid phone.